Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz, and I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. And I'm thrilled today to welcome Omar El Akkad to celebrate the release of his beautifully written, unrelentingly dramatic, and profoundly moving new novel, What Strange Paradise, in conversation with Lydia Kiesling. While the pandemic has taken a toll on all of our lives, virtual events like the one that you're about to see have become bright spots for us. And I want to give a very special thank you to our guests for joining us this evening, and to all of you at home for tuning in. Now to some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. To submit those, we'll be asking them at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, which is of course very important. One caveat for tonight's event is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that might arise, and we'll try to resolve them quickly. And we've scheduled a whole host of summer programming for you. So do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One event that I want to point out in particular is on Tuesday, August 24th. We're thrilled to welcome Louise Penny for the launch of her novel, The Madness of Crowds, in conversation with Dory Greenspan. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. And finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe settings, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, you can hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. And now a little about tonight's guests. We'll get started. Omar El Akkad is an author and a journalist. He has reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. His work earned Canada's National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism and the Gough Penny Award for Young Journalists. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Le Monde, Guernica, GQ, and many other newspapers and magazines. His debut novel, American War, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It won the Pacific Northwest Bookseller Association Award, the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, and the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize, and has been nominated for more than 10 other awards. It was listed as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, GQ, NPR, and Esquire, and was selected by the BBC as one of the 100 novels that shaped our world. Lydia Kiesling is the author of The Golden State, a 2018 National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, a finalist for the VCU Cabell First Novelist Award, and longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. She's a contributing editor at The Millions and Zizova, and her writing has appeared at outlets including the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker Online, and The Cut. So now, without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Omar and Lydia.
Hello. How are you? How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. I don't know what your experience is with these things, but it's always so much more nerve-wracking for me to be on the interviewing side of these things. So thank you so much for doing this. It really means a lot.
Well, it's really my pleasure because I, have already knew and loved your first book. And so I was glad to have a good reason to really get in early on your second book. And since I actually know you, I'm not as frightened as I might otherwise be. Although my hands are sweating. It's just like, I think whenever I see a Zoom, the tile screen, my hands will just start sweating. Thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight. I really do want to encourage you to buy both What Strange Paradise and Please from Community Bookstore, our hosts, and then also American War, which is such an excellent novel. And yeah, I have so many questions. Omar and I know each other a little bit. We had just gotten to know one another when I moved to Portland, which is close to where he lives, but then the pandemic happened. So this is kind of a funny way to reunite. And it's not the lunch that we might have enjoyed previously, but it's really a pleasure to be here. And I think we had agreed that Omar is going to start by reading us something from his beautiful new book.
Sure. So I what's the fastest possible synopsis? So this is a repurposed fable of sorts. It's a story of Peter Pan, rewritten as the story of a contemporary child refugee. It starts with a migrant shipwreck that washes up on this island, sort of unnamed Western island. And there's one child, this 9-year-old boy named Amir, who is the sole survivor of the shipwreck. And from that point onwards, the chapters alternate between before and after. So the after chapters are everything that happens after he lands in this island, and the before chapters are how he ended up in this place. So I'm gonna just read, if you'll indulge me, just the first couple of pages of the first chapter. The child lies on the shore. All around him, the beach is littered with the wreckage of the boat and the wreckage of its passengers. Shards of decking, knapsacks cleaved and gutted, bodies frozen in unnatural contortion. Dispossessed of nightfall's temporary burial, the dead ferment indecency. There's too much of spring in the day, too much light. Face down with his arms outstretched, the child appears from a distance as though playing at flight. And so too in the bodies that surround him, though distended with seawater and hardening, there flicker the remnants of some silent levitation, a severance from the laws of being. The sea is tranquil now, the storm is past. The island, despite the debris, is calm. A pair of plump orange-necked birds, stragglers from a northbound flock, take rest on a lamppost from which hangs one end of a police cordon. In the breaks between the wailing of the sirens and the murmur of the onlookers, they can be heard singing. The species is not unique to the island, nor the island to the species, but the birds, when they stop here, change the pitch of their songs. The call is an octave higher, a sharp, throat-scraping thing. In time, a crowd gathers near the site of the shipwreck, tourists and locals alike. People watch. The eldest of them, an arthritic fisherman driven in recent years by plummeting cherubfish stocks to kitchen work at a nearby resort, says that it's never been like this before on the island. Other locals nod, because even though the history of this place is that of violent endings, of galleys flipped over the axis of their oars and fishing skiffs tangled in their own netting, and once during the war, an empty Higgins lander sheared to ribbons by shrapnel, the old man is still in his own way right. These are foreign dead. No one can remember exactly when they first started washing up along the eastern coast, but in the last year it has happened with such frequency that many of the nations on whose tourists the island's economy depends have issued travel advisories. The hotels and resorts in turn have offered discounts. Between them, the Coast Guard and the morgue keep a partial count of the dead. And as of this morning, it stands at 1,026, but this number is as much an abstraction as the dead themselves are to the people who live here, to whom all the shipwrecks of the previous year are a single shipwreck, all the bodies a single body. 3 officers from the municipal police force pull a long strip of caution tape along the breadth of the walkway that leads from the road to the beach. Another 3 wrestle with large sheets of blue boat cover canvas, trying to build a curtain between the dead and their audience. In this way, the destruction takes on an air of queer unreality, a stage play bled of movement, a fairy tale upturned. The officers, all of them young and impatient, manage to tether the fabric to a couple of lampposts, from which the orange-necked birds whistle and flee. But even stretched to near tearing, the canvas does little to hide the dead from view. Some of the onlookers shuffle awkwardly to the far end of the parking lot, where there's still an acute line of sight between the draping and 4 television news trucks. Others climb on top of parked cars and sweep their cameras across the width of the beach, some with their backs to the carnage, their own faces occupying the center of the recording. The dead become the property of the living. Oriented as they are, many of the shipwrecked bodies appear to have been spat up landward by the sea, or of their own volition to have walked out from its depths and then collapsed a few feet later. Except the child. Relative to the others, he is inverted, his head closest to the lapping waves, his feet nestled into the warmer, lighter sand that remains dry even at highest tide. He is small, but somewhere along the length of his body marks the sea's furthest reach. A wave brushes gently against the child's hair. He opens his eyes.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. I'm sure that takes a toll to read that particular passage over and over again for these book events. And also thank you for providing the elegant synopsis of the book. I think it's always better for the writer to do that themselves than have the hapless MC try and do it. And if you see me looking at my phone, this is where I have my questions and notes. I promise I'm not like texting. And
I'm always so fascinated by how people do the moderating. Jeff Vandermeer had this like legal pad with like stuff crossed. It's always really fascinating to see people's format.
Well, normally that's what I do, like a handwritten thing. And then when we were talking about bits that we do, and like a bit is that I show how awful my handwriting is. But then I realized I actually could not read the handwriting. And so it was a bit that had no utility except to like be funny, but I then couldn't read the question. So I have now switched to a digital model. So I'm going to, well, I like that you said sort of in your synopsis that it's a repurposing of Peter Pan, because I remember when we were speaking about, your second book, which at that point you were completing edits, or, it was like far before the publication. And you said that I remember you said that it had fairy tale elements, but that it was also full of kind of Easter eggs and things that were sort of to please yourself on kind of hidden things. And I was like, damn, I'm gonna have to really like be smart to try and find all the references here. And I'm sure there are many that I missed, but I appreciate that, that you're like, no, Peter Pan is very central to the story. So this is like the epitome. This sounds like more of a comment than a question. I swear it will be a question. I was reading an interview that you did with Powell's, which was a really well done interview. And you said to the interviewer, and this to me is one of the things that I will never ever convince anybody of, but American War was not a novel about America. It was set in America, but was trying to tell a different kind of story. What Strange Paradise, which is set on the other side of the planet, is very much an American novel. We've also talked before about how, when American War came out, there was sort of like a resolute insistence on the part of readers to make it into like a Trump allegory, or to talk about it as like a future dystopia. And if I recall correctly, and then in my own reading of the book, that is not quite, I think, what you were doing there. And it's really a book that's more about the present in a lot of ways. But if you compare it to What Strange Paradise, which is also very much about the present, real events, the vehicle that you've chosen is completely different. Well, I think, with American War, there's much more kind of realism to the story. And What Strange Paradise has a more kind of parable, like aphoristic quality, that sort of fairy tale quality. And I'd love to know how you sort of chose the vehicles, whether there was like calculation to it, or just that's how they presented themselves to you, and how you kind of thought about the way to tell these particular stories.
It's a really fascinating question. I remember, I finished writing the first draft of American War in the summer of 2015. And then I think 3 weeks later or something, Donald Trump announced he was running for president. And the book ends up coming out 4 months into the Trump administration. And suddenly, like the first, those little Google News alert things that pop up, and the first ones that come up are like, here are the books you need to read to understand the Trump era. Nobody understands the Trump era, and it's great for the royalty statement. Like I can't complain. It's been great for book sales and all the rest of it. And also, like, I very much subscribe to that thing Borges said about how once the book leaves the author's hands, whatever they intended it to be doesn't matter in the slightest. And so, I can run around claiming that I tried to write whatever kind of book I tried to write, but it doesn't matter. It was read overwhelmingly as an attempt at prophecy, and as sort of, this is where we're headed, America, if we don't clean up our act. And I thought, because of the way I've structured, What Strange Paradise is a much quieter book. It's a shorter book. It's about half as long. And I thought, because of the way I structured it, and it's sort of one of those things that, like, depending on how familiar you are with the quotes from the epigraphs page, you have a pretty good idea of what's about to happen. And so I thought it was a pretty clear cut. Anyway, the first 4 people who read the manuscript came back with 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell was going on in this book. And I was, and again, there's a part of me that's like, oh, it's because I'm a misunderstood literary genius. That's certainly why any of this is happening, right? I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it in the slightest. It's just you come up with a particular container, and then you're walking this tightrope of, if they notice it, it's too obvious, and they'll roll their eyes, and you'll lose the impact. And if they don't notice it, it was never there. And I'm not nearly good enough to walk that tightrope perfectly all the time. And so I'm constantly falling in one direction or another. I mean, one of the examples, the way the book works is that very early on, this child wakes up on the shore, and he runs away from these officers who are trying to detain him. They thought everybody was dead on the shore, and they're trying to detain him and put him in the camp. And he runs through this forest, and on the other end, he runs into this girl, this teenage girl who's out in her front yard, and she gives him shelter and tries to sort of take him in and keep him away from these soldiers. And so early on in one of the early chapters, we're looking at the island, this sort of, it's based on Crete, but it's very much a fantastical island. All the flora and fauna is made up. And she lives there, and she's really pissed off at the nightclub down on the shore, because the nightclub keeps playing this one rap song over and over and over again. She can't stand it. And if you read, it's never really stated, but if you read between the lines, the song is Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z. So fast forward to the other end of the book, this migrant ship is headed towards this island. There's a huge storm, and somebody on the boat, there's a lot of Arabs on the boat, and one of the Arabs says, hey, listen, they're playing our music. It must be Arabs nearby because they're playing our music. Well, Big Pimpin' samples a mid-20th century pop song in Egypt called Khasara Khasara. And so what they're really hearing, they're hearing the sample, and they think it's an Arabic song. They think some Egyptian is playing this, but really it's that song from the nightclub. The Venn diagram of people who are familiar with Jay-Z's work and people who are familiar with mid-20th century Egyptian pop music is 2 largely non-overlapping circles. And so you try to construct this thing, and at certain points you have to, I think, decide who you're willing to lose. And this one, I leaned very heavily in the direction of being okay with that. I don't know if that was a good or, right or wrong decision, but it was just the sort of plan of attack you take for a particular manuscript, and you go down that road for better or worse.
Was this subject, telling a story of the refugee crisis, was that something that you knew for a while that you wanted to approach in fiction, or was it something that you kind of came sideways to? It actually, the first memory I have of something that sort of led me to think about the things that would eventually congeal into this book is I was in Egypt. I was born in Egypt. I lived there until I was 5 years old, and then I lived in the Middle East till I was 16. So all my extended family is Egyptian. I used to go back there a lot more often than I do now. Oh wow, Community Bookstore is on the ball. Yeah, good
Look
job.
at you. That's I was in Egypt in 2012, and I was still working as a journalist full time back then, and I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And I was driving around Cairo with an old high school buddy of mine who was complaining about like the most universal thing you can complain about: the rent is too high. And at one point I said, well, what's the rent for an apartment in your building, for example? And he said, well, do you mean the locals price or the Syrians price? And I said, what the hell's the Syrians price? And he said, well, we've been having these folks start showing up. There's an influx of Syrians coming into town, and they don't have much choice. They don't have any leverage. So you can charge them about 3 times as much. And what are they going to do? Sort of go somewhere else? And it became apparent very quickly that this was happening not just with rent, but like when you went to the fruit and vegetable stall down the street, there was a similar kind of exploitation going on. And this is in the context of all the Arab leaders running around saying, our Syrian brothers and sisters, the same way they've been saying our Palestinian brothers and sisters for decades, and none of it means anything. It's all nonsense. The bottom line was that there was a population that was exploitable, and so it was going to be exploited. And I was thinking about that a lot. And then a couple of years later, I was reading a story about a migrant shipwreck that had crashed in the Mediterranean. And the details were about as horrific as you would imagine. But the thing I remember about that is that that story was a subject of such immense outrage in this part of the world for about 24 hours. And then the next day, everybody had moved on to the next thing. And so the novel itself is in large part written very much against that idea of instantaneous forgetting, written against this idea that it's, to be a good progressive, you have to be sufficiently outraged at the thing for as long as the thing is in the center, and then move on and be sufficiently outraged about the next thing, and move on and move on and move on. And this is very much a novel that tries to dwell. So those were the two instances that got me thinking about writing this particular book. And as with American War, it takes years and years of just sort of like storing things in the filing cabinet in your head and then plucking them out at later times. And, eventually it kind of all comes together into something, which I assume, I don't know what your writing process is like for stuff like that. When you're writing The Golden State, is it also sort of a messy filing cabinet of little details, or do you have a pretty strong kind of like load-bearing beams go here kind of thing?
No. If my process was like a building, it would fall down. It's just not. I hope to one day have a process, but yes, the filing cabinet. I've heard someone describe it as composting, and I find that a very cheerful way of thinking about it. I'm
stealing that. That's very good.
I bet Jeff Vandermeer would like that. That's right up his alley. Well, I was like, I'm not going to talk shit during this thing, but I actually decided I'm going to. So I was recently reading a by the book in the New York Times. The New York Times asks writers to talk about what they've been reading. And it had Lionel Shriver, who is a writer who in the past I have admired her works, but I find her politics to be very reactionary lately. And maybe they were always like that, I don't know. But in her by the book, she wrote that she wanted to see a novel, or she said she wanted to see a novel that was about the refugee crisis, but from the other side, and about the strained hospitality of the places where refugees and migrants arrive. And it really, it pissed me off when I saw it, because I think all novels should kind of tell all the sides. But it was clear to me in that context that that's not really what she meant. It sort of, I felt like it was reaching for trying to paint like a more sympathetic portrait of what to me is like a political climate that is very like dangerous and violent. And, there are many like refugee camps being set on fire on Greek islands at any given moment. And, anyway, and then I read your book like very shortly after seeing this. And I was struck that one of the things I like so much about it is that it's just a human story. So it's telling all the human sides, which is, there are people who have motivations that are very unpleasant, regardless of where they are in like the structure of this drama that unfolds. And I was like, oh, well, actually, Omar wrote a novel where it is talking about just all the ways that people are. And yet I doubt that is what she had in mind. Anyway, that was sort of pointless talking shit, but I just had to get that out there because it just struck me.
I like it. That novel, I'm sure there's a tremendous version of that novel to be written, but it would be set in Lebanon, like the country that has taken 1 million refugees, as opposed to Western Europe, one of the richest societies in human history that's had a few thousand people on boats show up and suddenly are willing to kind of, dismantle the entire situation, like the whole barbarians at the gate thing, right? It's like, if we need to burn the place down so they don't get their hands on it, so be it. And that's fine, but also if a few thousand destitute people with nothing but the clothes on their back are enough to bring down your civilization has problems to begin with. So yeah, I'm sure that book, I'd love to read a version of that book to see what's happening in Lebanon or in Jordan, in Germany. I don't know.
Well, sort of to that point, did you there are novels that are, current, recently published, that are sort of dealing with the like current realities. Did you seek them out or did you avoid them as you're writing your own novel?
It's a hard question to answer because I tend to avoid all novels when I'm in the writing process. It's it's too potentially demoralizing to read what many better writers are doing. I don't know about you, but I'm very much I live in poetry when I'm in the writing process. I read poetry and I read creative nonfiction, and I should probably experiment with actually reading contemporary fiction while I'm writing contemporary fiction. That seems like probably a good thing to try out in case it makes my writing much better. But no, I the research portion, I mean, you know this better than I do, but the research portion involves a ton of reading and you're all over the place and you're digging into these sources that the sort of wandering down alleys portion of the research is pretty significant. So I was reading a lot of contemporary accounts of the migrant passage and sort of a lot of the little details in the book, things like using party balloons as waterproof containers, the cheapest kind of waterproof container. You have something in there and tie it up. That's the idea that a lot of these human smugglers will sell you life vests that are filled with foam. And so when you go under, they actually do the opposite of what they're supposed to do. They take in water. All of that stuff sort of works its way in from the research of what this passage is like. But the book that influenced me the most when I was writing What Strange Paradise is this book called The Wandering Jews, which was written about 100 years ago. And it's a nonfiction account of what was happening to the Jews in Eastern Europe who were facing immense persecution and decided to try and go west, try to go to the west end of the continent to get away from this. And lo and behold, you get to the west end of the continent and you are subject to all kinds of different persecution. And I fell into this book by accident, and the extent to which you could just change the dates and have something that felt so current really influenced the writing of the book. I mean, there's entire sections there about, well, of course they forge identity cards. They're being subjected to this ridiculous system. Like, what do you expect them to do? And seeing how little had changed really influenced thematically the way the book is constructed. And that's a book that I fell into completely by accident.
Do you remember how you did? Was it just one of those, like, if you read this book, you might also read this book, or like?
I think it was link hopping. I think I was reading something, and then there was like, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the research mode and I'm reading something on the web and there's anything that's in blue, I'm clicking on it and just open a new tab. And then eventually you have 300 tabs open and you have to kind of work your way through. And it was an article I think the gist of the article was like, hey, this book needs more attention. Like, this book didn't get any attention when it was published, but it's very sort of informative and indicative of what's going on. And so I went and picked it up and it blew me away. It's a very sort of indignantly written book. This person is very angry writing this. It's like, nothing has changed. And I was like, hey, I'm reading this 100 years later. Nothing has changed. Yeah.
Like, I too am pissed. This is
yeah. Exactly.
Well, I mean, that there's something beautiful about that a book that was, shared because it was like, no one pays attention to this book, and now it kind of has new life in a very different context. Let me look at our time. So if you have, I should say, we'll leave the last 15 minutes. So starting about 8:15 Eastern for Q&A. And I see there's a couple of cues already in the box, and I will moderate those. So if something is occurring to you as we speak, please, you have some time to pop it in there. So let's see. Let me consult my list here. I talked shit, check. So this is a process question, also that may be too emotional, but I know that your acquiring editor for American War was the great legendary editor, Sunny Mehta, and that he tragically passed away, I think right before the pandemic. And I just wondered if you wanted to speak about him at all, or your work with him, and I'm curious whether he had any opportunity to work with What Strange Paradise.
Yeah, I wrote 3 novels before American War. The sort of official literary term for them is terrible. They will never see the light of day. I'll never show them to anybody. My best friend Anna is the only one who's read them. She's a masochist. I don't know how she got there. Anyway, I wrote American War while I was still a journalist. I wrote it in my spare time. I wrote it between the hours of sort of midnight and 4 a.m. and then on the weekends, back when I didn't have kids and could do that sort of thing. But for a while after I finished it, it just sat on the hard drive as well. I was quite happy to write it and sort of move on. And I was never in the mindset of like, oh, I'm going to get a book deal and I'm going to do that. That wasn't there. And then one day I had a bad day at work, and I had a day where I felt like I was just rewriting press releases. And at the end of the day, I thought, to hell with this. And I emailed a literary agent who I'd met randomly 8 years earlier in passing. And I said, listen, I know that the scariest thing a literary agent can hear from a journalist is, hey, I have a novel for you, but I have a novel for you. Would you mind taking a look? And she took it. She very kindly just agreed to read it. 3 days later, she emails and says, I like it. I know the guy who might be good for it. His name is Sonny. You should look him up. And so I typed this guy's name into Google. The first thing that comes up is this Vanity Fair article. And I read the details and I'm like, oh, we're wasting our time. This is busy work. And for 3 months, we hear nothing. And then Sonny is one of those people who he would say very little, generally speaking. And so we get an email back that just says, I like it, or something like that. And a few weeks later, they made us an offer. And I mean, I was terrified. I'd read by this point that, he'd been in the business for 40 years. He'd published Toni Morrison. He's the reason The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy got written. So, yeah, so he was Douglas Adams's editor, and Douglas Adams had this immense success with the beginning Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it's like a 5-parter or whatever. And they'd already announced the last part of this thing. And then one day, Douglas Adams's agent calls Sonny and says, listen, I know publication is in a few months. He hasn't written anything. So Sonny runs over to his house, grabs him, books a hotel room, locks him in the hotel room, stays with him. There's just a typewriter on the desk in the hotel room, and will not let him out until he writes this thing. So every morning, Adams would get up, and just as like a finger warming up exercise, would curse out Sonny, would just type like, who the hell does he think he is, locking him up in here, and wrote. Anyway, that's the reason the thing got written. Also the reason it's really bad. If you read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the last one is not great, because it was written with Sonny Mehta putting a gun to Adams's head in a hotel room and telling him, write or you don't get out of this room. So he had that kind of track record, right? And so finally, we finished, we signed the contract, and I have my first phone call with him, and I'm sort of shaking, and he calls me up, and again, like the conversation lasts 5 minutes at the most. But he said this one thing. He said, with this book, you think you're reading one thing, but you're really reading something else. And as soon as he said that, I was like, yes, please be my editor for the rest of the time. He's so spectacular at seeing what the thing is. You read it, and he'd see what it is, and also what it could be. And he could handle both those things in his head at the same time. And I've never had an editor like that who had that kind of power. I love the man. I knew him for a relatively short period, and he taught me everything I know about the industry. He made me a far better writer. He bought this second novel, and we were on the second last version of it. It was like the 6th or 7th draft. And I sent it in December, and didn't hear anything back, and was getting sort of antsy, and then I find out that he was in the hospital. He had pneumonia, and he died, I think, on the last day of 2019. And so the last trip I did before COVID was to fly out to New York for the memorial service. There was this giant hall in the main branch of the New York Public Library, and there's all these people. There was Carl Bernstein, and who's the guy who runs the New Yorker, David Remnick, I want to say. It's that kind of crowd, and I'm there in the back, just kind of like, huddled. He was an incredible human being, and I owe him my career. And obviously the book's dedicated to him. But he was one of those people who, like, you get to say that now on your deathbed. Like, I get to tell my grandkids, like, oh yeah, for a while I worked with this guy. And then that means something. If I don't publish another book again, that means something.
Well, that's really, I'm so sorry for all of his writers and for his family. And but I'm glad to know that you were able to work with him on this book. And so he was kind of part of the process. I think I read that the book had some structural changes. I'm curious, is it unrecognizable from its first self, or is it, were they smaller shifts?
It was very similar to American War in that I tried some very ill-advised structural forms and didn't realize how ill-advised they were until I'd done the whole thing. There were the sort of things that require, like, it's not like insert this in chapter 5, it's like insert this into every chapter sort of thing. So for example, with American War, for a while in one of the drafts, I took out all of those fake historical documents that are in there. Between the chapters, there's like fake news articles and letters from the governor. Took all of those out and instead put in entries from the main character's diary. So wrote all of those, dozens and dozens of these things, inserted them. Very quickly afterwards, realized it wasn't working at all, took them all out, put the source documents back in. With this one, right now it alternates. Well, right now, like I'm going to be writing a revised edition, it started with the way similar to the way it is now. And then in the middle, I decided I would try interspersing monologues from everybody who's on this migrant ship. And so I wrote their backstories. And again, that's pages and pages and pages, inserted them in, realized it didn't work, took them out, went back to them. So it was that sort of thing. Okay. And I mean, I knew going in that it had to be it had to be a quiet book, and whatever tricks it was going to pull had to be quieter ones. So I was glad I wrote those backstories. I got to spend some more time with these folks, but it wasn't working structurally. So I went back to this before after setup.
That's really interesting because I feel like one of the sort of platitudes about writing that people trade to make ourselves feel better is that, you do all this research or you do something and then it ends up being like one sentence in the book. And it is a platitude, but I find it really true. And I think, it's funny to hear you say that because I think these characters, even for such a short, I was amazed by how short the book turned out to be once I had finished it, because I was very immersed in it. And because I think the characters who you meet, particularly on the boat, you do get a sense of who they are, even with these like very short glimpses. And so maybe that kind of makes sense that you somehow, by doing all that advanced work beforehand that then went away, it still like imbues them with something.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Do you pull people, or do you pull traits? Like when you're writing, do you pull whole people into the thing that or do you pull like traits from individuals, or do you do none of them?
I sort of combine people, and I do like counterfactual things. I don't know. It feels very, right now I'm combining like two semi-public figures into one, and it feels like so evil to do that, but it's also like really fun in some respects. And you're like, this is unimpeachable because this is not a real person. It is two real people grafted onto one another. So, okay, well, I see we have questions. So I'm going to open up here. And I actually have the same question. So anonymous attendee asks, tell us more about the epigraphs. So perhaps you could read them because they are short. Did you have them in mind while you were writing, or did they come to you later?
Thank you for that. It allows me to say the super insufferable author thing. I spent a lot of time on these epigraphs, just making sure to get them right. I had a file called epigraphs. The two that open up the book are the first one is from a short story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. It did not appear to be the duty of these two men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the two ends of the foot planking that traversed it. And then the second one is from the original Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. I taught you to fly. I taught you to fight and to fly. What more could there be? So if I said earlier at the beginning that this was sort of a repurposed fable, that it was Peter Pan kind of reinterpreted, if you're not sort of intimately familiar with Peter Pan and the story behind how that got written and all of that, I think you can go through this whole book and not see a single sort of sliver of Peter Pan in it. It's written that way. But one of the things I really wanted to do, and I knew I wanted to do going into it, was to take a comforting fairy tale or fable that Westerners had been telling their kids for 100 years and invert it. A lot of my, it's not a particularly clever trick, but a lot of my writing turns on that trick of inversion. I'm going to take this and turn it around. And when we talk, when we talk about Peter Pan today, we talk about like Peter Pan syndrome, where it's the grown man who won't stop acting like a child. The origins of that fable are the inverse of that. J.M. Barrie's older brother died. I think it was a skating accident when he was 13, and it wrecked the family. His mother never recovered. And so the roots of Peter Pan, the things that I think J.M. Barrie was thinking about when he went on to create this character, have much more to do with the idea of the child who won't get a chance to become a man, rather than the man who won't stop acting like a child. So I thought that it worked in that context. And then there's very little I can say about an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge without wrecking the whole thing. Suffice to say, it's a very famous Civil War era short story. And depending on what you know about the structure of that story will heavily inform your reading of this particular novel. And I'm going to go ahead and shut the hell up about that part of it.
Yeah, I realized before, I was like, I wonder how long this story is, because do I have time to read it in the next like 20 minutes and find something smart to say about it? But then I decided that I would just read it afterwards.
That's how you know it's a good novel, is that it imposes homework on you. That's how you know that just like, here's the things you need to read for this not to be awful. Yeah.
Well, and I feel, and Ambrose Bierce, I don't think pops up in much of the fare that I consume on a daily basis. So I was like, all right, I must seek out this deep cut.
No, he was a weird guy. At one point in his 70s, he was like, I'm going to go check out the Spanish-American War or something, and then just disappeared and nobody ever saw him again.
Yeah, that's the only thing I know about him. And then he like had some quote where he said, if you found I die shot to rags against a Mexican wall, like that was pretty good for me, or something like that. Yes, he wrote that in a letter.
That sounds on brand for sure.
All right, so next anonymous attendee asked, and I also want to know this, who were some of the poets you were reading while writing this book?
So one of the ones that I was reading pretty closely, because her work ended up informing the title of the actual book, is Emma Lazarus. So Emma Lazarus is most famous by far for The New Colossus, which is the poem that's etched into the Statue of Liberty, bringing your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. But she was, I guess this would have been turn of the previous century. She was very, very concerned with the plight of European Jews. And so she ends up writing, this is by far the most disconcerting. Okay, you're okay. All right. I was like, she must really hate Emma Lazarus.
It's a cat. It's just, he scratches at the door. And if I don't let him in, he'll just stand there scratching until there's a hole in the door. There is nothing, it happens in every single Zoom. So, but I was listening.
What's super disappointing now is that this is the peak. This is the most entertaining any virtual event I'm going to do, is going to be, this cat is going to upstage me.
So Emma Lazarus.
So she was very much concerned with the plight of Eastern European Jews, much like Roth, who wrote The Wandering Jews. And she had, so the title comes from one of her poems, not a very good one, I must say, but a fitting one. One of my favorite poems of hers is about these two Jews who escape persecution in Eastern Europe, go halfway around the world and find themselves in rural Texas, of all places. And so the gist of the poem is these two guys sitting around saying, oh my God, we're safe. Thank God. What the hell is this place? Like, we don't understand any of the customs. We don't know what these people are doing. This is all ridiculous. And that sense kind of, it worked its way obviously into the book. And obviously the title, What Strange Paradise, has an element of that. Of like, I finally got to the place where I was going. What is this? The book is very much kind of this collision of two fantasies, right? The fantasy that a lot of folks in my side of the planet have about the West, which is once we get there, everything will be fine. And then the fantasy headed in the other direction of, oh, all these people over there are barbarians at the gates, and we need to stop them at any cost. Reality in this novel is subservient to both those fantasies. They take precedence over what's actually happening. I was reading that, and then I was reading my favorite poem, my favorite poet, who I read all the time, Jory Graham, who is just operating at a level that is at once like right on my wavelength, and sort of like just doesn't even have to knock on the door emotionally, just barges right in. And then at the same time, just so much more skilled at a technical and emotional level than anything I will ever write. And this is what I mean about like that level of looking up at the stars doesn't demoralize me in the same way that when you're doing this to a piece of long form fiction, when you're doing this to a piece of prose. For some reason, when I do that, when I'm writing and I come across a really good novel, it brings everything to a grinding halt. But it doesn't happen with poetry. I think it's sort of like when you're a long distance swimmer and then you watch another long distance swimmer and their strokes are so much more graceful, and they figured out all these tricks to not getting eaten by sharks, and they're doing all of this stuff and it just looks effortless. That is demoralizing in a way than like watching a really graceful diver do the spins and sort of land without splash, do a rip entry into the water. That doesn't demoralize me in the same way. It inspires me. But that's all stuff I should be taking up with my therapist. That's just insecurity and weird pettiness more than anything else.
Well, no, I recently picked up a novel and I was like, well, this sucks. I can't do this. I'm not going to be able to do this. There is something, there is like a little bit of performance anxiety. But at the same time, if you're like a constitutional reader, which I think most writers are, you sort of can't be okay if you're not like consuming something like generative and soul feeding. I swear I'm a writer. I don't know what soul feeding is. We're just going to strike that from the recording. But okay, poetry, that's a good, because I love poetry, and maybe it won't make me feel like I'm.
There's also the last book that tricked me was I thought I was reading poetry and I wasn't. The Long Take. I don't know if you read this. It was longlisted for the Booker or shortlisted for the Booker, I'm pretty sure, a couple of years ago. But The Long Take by Robertson. I want to say Robert Robertson, but that just might be my brain, like, just mashing words together. But The Long Take is an incredible. I read it. It's a 350 page poem. It's a prose poem, and it's every line is incredible, but it's also a better novel than anything. It's about this guy who than anything I'm going to write. It's about this guy who comes back to sort of post-war LA, and he's carrying all this trauma from the war, and it's like this noirish, just Robin Robertson. Okay, I was closer than I expected. Community Bookstore is sharp, man. That is. So that was a book that managed to do both things, inspire me at watching a really graceful dive, but also this guy can write a better novel than you. That was a double punch, but that's an incredible book.
Well, thank you for that. I have not heard of it, and it sounds, maybe if I can ever finish my book, I will read it. So the next question, this kind of feeds nicely into that, from Jasmine. What are you doing to be tender with yourself during this really awful time? So nice to see your face.
Thank you for showing up to this, Jasmine. I appreciate it. Jasmine's awesome. This is one of the scary things about saying something like that, is that like I'm 95% certain I know which Jasmine we're talking about, but maybe it's somebody who's got the same name, and
the last name Petit.
Yeah, no, I know. She's an incredible writer and runs an incredible. But again, you're saying this like she runs an incredible storytelling show in Portland, and then like this might be an entirely different Jasmine, just being like, what are you talking about?
We'll put that in the memory hole too. Then we're just gonna,
Okay, we'll just mute anybody who contradicts me. That's the way I like to do these things. One of the weird things about this, what we do, is that there is an inherent kind of emotional whiplash and psychological whiplash. You spend years of your life alone in a room doing quite possibly the least interesting job to talk about that there is, right? Like I just sat in front of a computer and then I wrote a bunch of stuff and then I deleted most of it. And then I wrote some, like it's just so fundamentally boring and internal and kind of inward looking. And then years later, the book comes out and you switch and you're doing events and you're doing interviews and so that I find harder. The writing is difficult in its own way, but that turn really messes with me. And so I've been trying my best to. I'm a middle-aged man. I know what it is I'm into now. There's very little. So it just so happens that the only thing I really do is I go down to the climbing gym and I punt around on the wall. And that used to be a lot more forgivable and less embarrassing when I was in my 20s. But now it's like these kids who are half my age are like flying up the wall, and I'm sitting there like my joints are making trombone sounds as I try to get up this thing. But it's my very pathetic self-care routine. I'm trying my best to. I think one of the issues I have with the kind of work I do is that I write these stone cold bummers, and it's straight up. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It's hard to celebrate them, like it's hard to celebrate books that come out of a world that you wish was a different world. And so I'm missing that component. I think sometimes I see other writers and their book has come out and they've got their cake and they've got their party and they're doing their thing. And I'm so happy for them that I don't write stuff that's conducive to that. And so what I try to do is just schedule some emptiness. I'm not going to write. And I'm probably not even going to read. I'm not going to do, there's going to be this window of like long naps and maybe garbage TV, maybe, you try to schedule that kind of thing and make it okay to not be hyper productive all of the time or trying for something all of the time. And the last thing I do, which I will never, ever share well, I don't know. I write comedy. I know that if you have any experience with my personality, that seems like the worst idea in the world. But I go back to that and I do that mostly for myself and like the 3 friends I have. So those things generally kind of keep me afloat.
I can't believe you're going to drop that on us with like 8 minutes left in the evening. That's.
You want to hear the story of the comedy piece that's going to wreck my career in the spring? Yes. I'm happy to.
Absolutely.
So a couple of years ago, I got contacted by this group called Selected Shorts. They're out of New York. They do this thing where they commission short stories and then they get professional actors to perform them live on stage before an audience. Mm-hmm. So they asked me to be part of what I think is like their 35th anniversary or something. And I said, great, this sounds awesome. Let's do it. And I started writing this thing and the pandemic hit. And so I was writing one of my trademark depressing stories and also being super depressed by the pandemic. And finally I hit the uncanny valley where like the more depressed I get, the more depressing my writing is, until a certain point where I'm like, I need to write comedy again. So I wrote this parody of the commercials that were coming out during the early days of the pandemic, where it's like, from our family to yours in this dark time, please continue buying Toyotas, or, that sort of thing, right? So I wrote a parody of that. And it's the silliest, most juvenile, and the jokes were dated like a week after I wrote them, right? Like this was a very specific moment in time and it passed. Anyway, they keep pushing back the date of performance because of COVID. Uh-huh. So now it's been pushed to spring of next year. The jokes that were dated 2 years, like a year ago, are now, anyway, and also they want to publish it in an anthology. So there's going to be this anthology. And they're like, can you write us a little description of why you wrote this particular story? Here's some examples. And they show me the examples from the other writers. And it's like, yeah, I chose to write about incest. And, because of that, all the other stories are dark and depressing. And then there's my ridiculous parody nonsense. And then a few weeks ago, they write and they're like, oh, also we're considering some of these stories to adapt into musical numbers. Can we consider? I was like, what is happening at this? Like, I fully don't understand what. Anyway, so spring, that thing's going to come along, and just it's a career ender. It's going to be sandwiched between 2 super dark stories by writers with like way more accolades than me. And there's going to be this thing that's going to confuse and disturb the audience. And that's the first piece of comedy I've written for public consumption in like 15 years.
I can't wait, because really, yeah, they're going to be expecting a sober topic of global importance. And you're going to hit them with your,
or like the opposite, right? Like somebody hears that story, it's like, that's pretty funny, I should go check out his novels. Oh no, but it's, you know, like they're gonna, that might happen. I don't know.
Well, then you can pay for more childcare. Just keep the royalties coming. Okay, anonymous attendee. I want to be sure I get everybody. I think we have 2 more questions. You talked earlier about dwelling and forgetting, and I'm wondering what came out of the process of dwelling as you wrote this book. Has it affected your outlook since?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't know how much longer I'm able to write these kinds of books. So I was a journalist for 10 years, and one of the things you do, particularly when you're covering the sorts of stories that I got a chance to cover, which is, you know, you're out in Afghanistan and you're watching, you know, what an RPG does to a house or that sort of thing. And you're, one of the things you're constantly trying to do is contend with the reality that you are a tourist in somebody else's misery. And no matter how empathetic you might try to be, or no matter how much you might tell yourself that this is for the greater good, or what, you get a chance to leave. That's the fundamental thing. You always get a chance to just go away. And when you're in journalism, you can at least tell yourself, yes, but I'm writing down the first draft of history, and that offsets whatever my personal unease with this may be. And also I might change things, you know, by getting this story out in the paper. That's much harder to do when you're making shit up, when you're in fiction. And I don't know if I have the right to write about the things I write about. I don't know how much longer I can remain in that space. And you tell yourself over and over again, at least I'm writing a thing that's going to outlive me. You know, long after I die, this thing's going to be sitting on a library shelf somewhere. And that has an inherent value that offsets this ugliness I feel about the kind of writing I'm doing and the kind of topics I'm tackling. But like, I genuinely, when I was in my early mid-30s, thought that American war was going to change the world and cause, you know, the West to stop bombing brown people, and everything was going, none of that at all. It's not, and it was naive and silly to think in those terms in the first place, right? So the older I get, the less faith I have in the idea of that kind of tangible change. I think the change that these things induce is much more amorphous and ephemeral. With the dwelling in this case taught me to think a little bit differently about the idea of empathy. I think in the West, particularly, one of the reasons all my favorite writers hate that word and hate that sentiment is because I think in the West, it is very much infected with the idea of individualism and manifest destiny, and this notion that if you just empathize hard enough, you can make everything better. And one of the things I try to do is strip that away from the idea of empathy and bring it back to, you know, the original term, which I think is German, Einfühlung, which means to look into, I think. Anyway, this idea that if you can grab somebody and have them look through a different pair of eyes for however long it takes to read the novel, that's good enough. That does the job.
The last question, is somewhat related to this, but what's inspiring you or giving you hope right now? Well, I guess it's not, it's conversely, and what's driving your next project? And that's from Brian Conley.
Hey, Brian, the next project is a page and a half old, and I will say nothing about it because it's definitely getting deleted and will become 10 different things. I think it's the same thing as yeah, easy for you to say, buddy. You come here and write this damn thing. It's going nowhere. It's a page and a half and it's already going nowhere. The thing that inspires me is the thing that's always been inspiring me, which is not just the art that people I admire make, but the act of making it. So I'm thinking here of, I just got my hands on a new manuscript. The book's coming out very shortly in translation, but it's by an Egyptian writer called Basma Abdelaziz. And Basma Abdelaziz's most famous book is The Queue. It came out in English. It got really good reviews here. And it was sort of it was the most Kafkaesque thing I'd read since Kafka. It's about this sort of made up country, Egypt, after a made up revolution, Arab Spring with a made up government, this going, and it's sort of these people waiting in an endless line to get, like one guy has to prove he's still alive So he's trying to get the paperwork for that. He's got this bullet lodged and he's have to prove it. It's that kind of thing. And it was brilliantly done. It's one of the best sort of post-Arab Spring ennui kind of books that I've read. She has a new one coming out, roughly translated as like, here are where the bodies are, or something like that. And it gave her all kinds of shit in Egypt. The cops were going around to book fairs and snatching this thing off the shelves. And it's unclear whether she'll be able to live in Egypt long term, like whether she'll be able to remain in the country. And so it's not just the writing. It's not just, here is a body. Goddamn, we got, before we leave, we got to come up with something they can't immediately find a link to. I'm just going to make up books, just say random titles. Anyway, so it's not just the work. It's that someone, knowing full well that this could end her up in a secret prison or exile or something, is doing the work. I think that's giving me hope. That I'm deeply concerned with like diseased systems, with things that aren't working structurally, and so I get my hope from individuals who are hammering against the sides of those load-bearing beams, trying to knock the whole thing down. So that's right.
Thank you all so much. We nailed it. Well, now it's 5:31. We did nail it. It was 5:30.
Sorry.
Perfect timing and a really hopeful note to end it on. Thank you both so much for doing this. This was a real delight to listen to and to be a part of. So thank you for this wonderful conversation. Those of you at home, please do consider purchasing a copy of What Strange Paradise from Community, and we hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Omar, Lydia, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.